Thomas Chatterton Williams, welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks. It's good to be back with you, Yascha.
It's always a pleasure, Thomas. Your new book is all about the summer of 2020, but really more broadly about what the summer of 2020 tells us about this juncture of American history. It's funny reflecting back at those events, as I was obviously doing reading the book, because they seem so momentous at the time, and I think that they are deeply impactful on where we are at today. And at the same time, they feel so remote. The pandemic has in many ways been memory holed. It's rare that we think about it these days, in part because it was an unpleasant time. I think people like to kind of bracket it out. But even the racial reckoning, which more than the pandemic is really at the heart of your book, feels like something that we're really downplaying now. These were the biggest protests against racial injustice probably in the history of mankind, as you point out. They did go hand in hand with significant public disorder and a strange cultural moment motivated by very real anger, very real injustice, but that could nearly be described in parts as a strange kind of mania, all of us pretending that people like Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo were the great sages of the age. And even some of the ideas that animated that particular strand of it now have been memory holed, and we pretend that, we never believed in them. Talk us through this strange paradox.
Yeah, it's so strange. This was one of the most momentous and I guess like passionately felt moments or years in our collective lives. But today we almost have this impulse to only focus narrowly on the present and to act as though that time isn't still relevant to the political and cultural events that we're dealing with now. And I think that it's inextricable from the present moment. This was an enormous rupture. It's really one of those, I think, hinge years where there was a before and there was an after. Like 1968 or maybe 2001, it was a pivotal moment, and there's a kind of criticism that you get whenever, especially if you're not a supporter of Donald Trump, you're not in the MAGA movement, if you're a liberal who insists on pointing out the kind of I think self-sabotaging overreach that the progressive left subjected us all to when they were ascendant in the institutions that really influence our public lives. When you point that out, there's this kind of reflexive response that's beside the point now, because people are being snatched in front of the Home Depot, or all of these other kind of egregious abuses that the Trump administration really is doing. They say it's beside the point, or they say it didn't happen like that. There's a kind of desire to downplay the excesses of 5 years ago. And so, I think you cannot understand the intensity of the backlash that really is, I think, worse than what happened in 2020 that we're living through now, without understanding the kind of cultural events and ideas that didn't cause, but absolutely provided a kind of justification for the abuses of power that are happening now. You can find any number of examples, but there's always an argument that you've been one of the best voices pointing out that wokeness, or whatever you want to call it, is a kind of it creates the reactionary backlash. These things feed off of each other, and the only real solution is a principled liberalism in the middle that many people don't want to actually buy into, or get exhausted from attempting to buy into.
Yeah, and I think one of the concerns that we've obviously shared in this space is that a lot of people want to say, on the one side, there is this form of right-wing authoritarian populism, demagogues like Donald Trump. On the other side, there is, wokeness, and you have to choose, because they're enemies and because the political sphere feels increasingly like it's split between them. You have to think about which of those two is the lesser evil. And then pick your side. Some people might pick the side of Trump. A lot of our friends and acquaintances in our social circle will then pick the side of versus liberal strands on the left. And the argument that I've always made, and I know you've always made as well, is that this is a false way of thinking about it. That one, when you put these forms of left-wing illiberal thought in competition with those forms of right-wing illiberal thought, often the right-wing forms of illiberal thought are going to win, and I think there's plenty of evidence for that from around the world. But the second, that it's a forced choice, that these two movements actually nourish and reinforce each other, that each is the excuse for the other, and the only way to break out of that really dangerous spiral is to have a principled alternative, which allows us to live more peacefully and sensibly together. Take us back to that moment in 2020. The pandemic is raging. There's still very heavy restrictions on people being able to leave their homes, to socialize, to go to church services, to attend funerals. And then those videos of George Floyd dying in the streets of Minneapolis, of being murdered in the streets of Minneapolis, are starting to make the rounds on social media. You're in Paris at that point. Sort of, when did you recognize that this was going to be a seminal cultural moment, a turning point in how we think about race, and how did you perceive those events at the time?
Yeah, I remember that moment so vividly, and it's early in the book. This kind of, my family and I were lucky to have left Paris at the beginning of the pandemic, and we were sheltering in place closer to the ocean in the west of France with some friends at their house. And I remember, I had 6 hours, and I went upstairs to the office I was using and went onto Twitter and saw this video that, you saw so many videos of violence over the years, but this one really stood out. And I said to myself at the time, wow, that's really something awful. But I was still amazed by the degree to which it went viral, as I think everybody must have been. But if you pull back and look at that moment and remember it, we had been, by that point, locked down in a way that none of us really have a memory of. Nothing like that had happened in our lifetimes. We were all quarantined. We were all also dealing with kind of relatively novel technologies that have changed the way that information is disseminated and the way that people collectively organize around the same few memes and the same few arguments and ideas. This book is really trying to make sense of the way in which whatever happened in 2020 couldn't have happened without a confluence of at least three factors, which is the pandemic, the racial reckoning, and the kind of specter of Donald Trump that's haunting all of it and intensifying every political disagreement. So we're all, organized around this kind of homogenous reality that's coming to us through the screens that we're glued to, and the pause of our real lives gives people a lot of time to reflect on issues that they might not be able to devote so much attention to, were they still having to go to work and take their kids to soccer practice and all that. So there's this kind of downtime as well. And if you remember, there had been for quite some time by that point an urge to rebel against something. And part of the country was rebelling against lockdown orders. And that was considered politically unacceptable if you were not part of the right. That was not to be done. And those were grandmother killers and all of this, selfish people who wanted to operate their hair salons while a black plague was descending upon the country, because this was also already by that point a racialized pandemic. The New Yorker ran a piece called The Black Plague, and there was a kind of biological racecraft applied to the idea that poorer people in certain communities who were working in certain types of more high-risk jobs and were, as a result of that, at greater risk of exposure and at greater risk of death from COVID, that it was actually, in fact, a racial effect of the pandemic. These things were kind of conflated.
As a side note, explain to our audience what you mean by this term racecraft, which I think is a really useful term that has come to be in use in certain circles, but I think is still not known that widely, as coined by Barbara and Karen Fields, Tell us a little bit what you mean when you say there's this biological racecraft, where the New Yorker and other mainstream publications were kind of portraying this as though there was a natural biological basis to the racially disparate effects that the pandemic may have had at a certain stage of its development. Later on, actually, the pandemic, in a way that was never broadly covered in the media, ended up affecting and killing proportionately as many or even more white people than ethnic minorities.
Yeah, it's the slipping of race into a kind of explanation where other factors actually can explain what's going on. But race, it's not racism, it's the use of the kind of idea that racial difference is real. And it's a reification of the racial categories. So a good example that Barbara and Karen Fields, the two scholars who are sisters who coined the term, use is that, there's this swimming pool that's segregated, or is effectively segregated, and a bunch of inner city black kids are brought to the pool and start to swim, and all of the white people get out of the pool, and they say that they get out of the pool because the kids are black. They couldn't swim in the pool, and the police come and the kids have to leave, and the kids can't swim in the pool because they're black. That's not why they can't swim in the pool. But race just slips in, and we almost without thinking about it think that that's actually, that there is an explanation in which the color of one's epidermis actually is the reason they can't swim in a pool, when there's all these other assumptions and kind of like gestures and habits and ways of thinking and seeing difference and making meaning in that difference that are at play that have nothing to do with anything biological. So I'm saying that there's slipping in, there's a racecraft in saying that this was a black plague and black and brown people are more at risk from COVID, when in fact what you're talking about is people that work in certain jobs, people without certain economic means at their disposal, all of these factors, but there is nothing biologically or racially real about the discrepancy in the numbers we were seeing. And so that kind of slips into the conversation and makes it about white supremacy and all these other things instead of about epidemiological responses to an epidemic that is still unfolding. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, one way to capture this, I don't think that gets to the full breadth of what Karen and Barbara Fields is saying here, is that, in France, social scientists tend to look at class but not race. And so they see everything through class terms, even when there's a racial dimension. In the United States, we tend to look at racial differences, but not at class differences. And so, some of these early differences in who was affected by COVID had to do with, differences in age structure and family structure, differences in who's likely to be in certain kind of frontline jobs. Those each have reasons that have to do with America's history and therefore also with certain forms of racial injustice. But to sort of go from, black people at this stage of the pandemic are more affected by COVID, in part because perhaps they're more likely to work frontline jobs where they're continuing to be out there during the high phase of a pandemic, to saying this is the Black Plague. And there's something kind of nearly metaphysical about the way in which it attacks the black body. That's what I think the Field sisters would rightly decry as a form of racecraft.
Absolutely.
To go to this moment, I mean, it's interesting to look at a few of these different elements, one of which is the pandemic and then the way that intersects with the online world. The first thing is that I think pandemics bring us in touch with our mortality, and moments in history when we're in touch with our mortality, whether that is the actual plague or other pestilent diseases or wars, is that they tend to create millenarian movements. And I think there's a kind of obvious connection between those two things that was somewhat missed in 2020. I mean, there was something about the summer of George Floyd, which was a millenarian movement. And I don't think that is a coincidence that came at the time of the pandemic. A second, more prosaic reason is that you were locked in at home without being able to go see your friends, without being able to go see family. And then when this happened and the first protest broke out and 1,000 public health officials said it is good for public health for people to go protest, it was the one experience of collective effervescence you could have. You couldn't go to a concert. You couldn't go play basketball with your friends. You couldn't go to church for that matter. You could go take part in those protests. And that surely was a very important element of this as well.
Well, yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say when we went off into the conversation on racecraft, is that, it was politically unrespectable to go out and rebel against stay-at-home orders or anything like that. That was right-coded. But suddenly, there was a righteous cause that you could actually join, and that would allow you to go outside and rebel. And it would be seen through the prism of moral clarity. And it would be completely different, you were even told by public health officials that it would be different because racism is also a pandemic. We were told there was a letter signed by over 1,000 public health officials and physicians that said that they could not in good conscience tell people not to mask collectively in the fight against racism, when just prior to the day that George Floyd was killed, their guidance was to make sure you do not mask collectively. So this was really something that happened like with the flip of a switch. That, like, one day we're shaming people for being out in the streets, the next day we're actually shaming people for not being out of the streets. And I mean, literally, not where is your black square on Instagram? What are you doing in this moment of racial reckoning? You can't just be sitting home and being complacent or self-centered. So that was really a shocking thing to see. And I think you're right about the millenarian impulse. There was a kind of sense of, the institutions that we believe protect us clearly are letting us down. The president's on TV every day saying, maybe drink some bleach, maybe shine light inside your body, things like this. He's kind of cavalierly playing with the body politic. And I think people felt, and this is one of the things that I think is very moving about the moment. I don't mean to disparage it entirely. I mean, I think there was very earnest kind of goodwill that many people in the country felt about earnestly trying to improve the society and fight something that seemed horrific. That this man was so callously kneeled upon for 10 minutes, essentially, until he died in plain daylight in front of a bunch of onlookers, and people themselves were feeling vulnerable and were outraged that a policeman could so cavalierly play with their safety, as it felt like the president of the United States was even cavalierly playing with all of our safety and his mismanagement of the pandemic. I think there was a real sympathy that was genuine, but I think it's had all kinds of disastrous consequences, especially when we got to the point that lawlessness, disorder, rioting, looting, violence, all of this can be justified when one is feeling that their kind of political disagreements are not being taken seriously through the proper venues.
Yeah, I feel like one way to think about this is to try to separate out the noble core of that moment. And like you, I share the instinct to say, the biggest mass protests against racism in favor of racial justice in the history of humanity must have something noble about them.
Yeah.
And I've always believed that we shouldn't cede the term of anti-racist to people with a very peculiar brand of ideology rooted in a particular kind of form of critical race theory. I'm deeply and proudly and fundamentally an anti-racist. I'm just a universal anti-racist, somebody who opposes racism on universalist grounds, because I don't think that race or those forms of racecraft have anything to do with the worth of an individual human being, and therefore oppose social arrangements which denigrate people or relegate them to second-class citizenship or mistreat them on the basis of that racecraft. But there's that very noble instinct, which is, I think, what brought the vast majority of participants out into the streets, into these protests, in a particular historical moment that also helps to explain some of that collective fervor. And then there's sort of a form it took, right? And one part of the form it took is, like any mass protest, that you then end up having riots and public disorder. Not like any public protest, but many. But somehow we weren't willing and able to talk about that, right? Like the nobility of a cause in whose name those riots were happening, even if in many cases they really had nothing to do with them, either in terms of who the people rioting were, or the nature of a rioting, like, robbing stores in Soho in New York, in any way contributing to that goal, somehow made such big swaths of mainstream media unwilling to criticize or even just to acknowledge that. And, you had outlets like NPR running articles in favor of looting, right, by highly privileged people who are writing these pieces, of course. The second question, the second tragedy, I think, of that moment is, how is it that anti-racist instinct, which I think for most people was a universalist instinct, was an instinct to say, why is it that disproportionately many black people are killed by police in this country, right? Why is it that the history of slavery still has all of these after effects in our society today, then got commandeered by this very strange ideology, promulgated by the sort of sages of 2020, like Kendi and D'Angelo, who were sacralized, who were, whose ideas were pushed forward in such a way that the mildest disagreement with them felt like sacrilege, and that mainstream outlets, killed articles by regular columnists and contributors and staff writers that would criticize them in any kind of way for fear of their own staff and outside reactions, etc. And then somehow 5 years later, we pretend these ideas never existed, and those figures have basically fallen out of public life. So what is the kind of tragedy that all of this energy doesn't get channeled and fomented into building an ideology that can actually improve America and help the country live up to its grandest promise, but rather gets hijacked by these ideas that feel all powerful in 2020 and now are not fully, I don't want to overstate the point, but to a large extent disowned even by the people who were its loudest mouthpieces, not half a decade ago.
One of the reasons you can't cleanly extricate the current crisis from what preceded it is because take, for example, the backlash against DEI and things like this. That backlash is not coming out of nowhere. The truth is that very few black people actually find themselves living day to day in the same circumstances that George Floyd was living in. He's a real member of the kind of American subaltern. The man is impoverished, without education, without resources or connections, addicted to drugs. He died as a black man, but he also died first and foremost, I would argue, as a poor man. And that is not a condition that is universally shared by black Americans in the year 2020. What this quickly became, and also I would say that the numbers of unarmed black men who are killed in police custody are actually quite low in a nation of this size. They're higher than is acceptable, they're higher than in comparably rich countries, but it is not the kind of genocide or epidemic that it was described as at the time. But one thing that actually caught on very quickly was that the way to address when inequality and racial bias and oppression become expanded, it can become an HR issue. It can become an issue of access to elite institutions and greater equity within kind of the meritocratic spaces that everybody wants access to. And so the issue of George Floyd's death was able to be used almost metaphorically in a way that his kind of victimization was a garment that could be donned by anybody who could claim membership in that identity group. And you saw really pretty extraordinary things happen in 2020. Nothing actually shocked me more than what happened at the Poetry Foundation, if you remember this. The Eli Lilly pharmaceutical fortune endowed the Poetry Foundation with a $257 million endowment. They were in charge of Poetry Magazine. In the wake of George Floyd, days after George Floyd died, you immediately had people who have no life experiences that resemble George Floyd's whatsoever, claiming that the entire Poetry Foundation's board and operating structure had to be reimagined and the endowment had to be made available to them so that they could figure out how to use it to fund black, I forget the phrase, but like black flourishing. Things like this started to happen. It mattered that, George Floyd died, so my play on Broadway has to be funded. George Floyd died, so I need this fellowship at Harvard. This was really happening. So we live in a moment now where the backlash to DEI is such that it's bone chilling, Yascha. They are shaking down the greatest institutions of higher learning that have ever been created. They are shaking them down like protection rackets in Brooklyn in the 40s or something. It's astonishing, but it is
shame if something bad should happen to your lovely university you've got over here.
Exactly. But it is a reaction to something else that happened that was unbelievable, actually, that George Floyd died, so I have to run the Harvard Law Review. So it's not the same in proportion, but it is not exactly a kind of unimaginable reaction to previous shakedowns that were happening. What happened at the Poetry Foundation was like a mixture of, I call it in the book, it was a combination of Barbarians at the Gate and Mau Mauing the Flat Catchers, if you know these two books. It was a hostile takeover with the techniques that Tom Wolfe was already remarking on, of kind of playing on racial guilt. And it was effective. And it inspired an enormous amount of resentment. People who are angry about it haven't forgotten. People who thought, this was a response to an outrageous death of a man in Minneapolis seem to have memory hold the extraordinary abuses that were countenanced and sometimes even deemed necessary.
Yeah, I have a few thoughts on this. I mean, one is that often in politics, the anger is elicited by one thing, but the sort of area in which somebody has agency doesn't match that cleanly. But that's what it ends up having impacts on. To use a completely different example, the reason why the Trump administration is going after the universities is probably to be found in comparative literature departments and perhaps departments of American studies and departments of Middle Eastern studies or something like that. But the federal government doesn't fund those departments. It funds mostly scientific labs through the NIH and other kind of funding bodies, and so it's able to go after the hard sciences, even for what it's angry about is the humanities. And so there's a sort of weird, beyond the fact that, as you're saying, it's just an immoral protection record, mafia-style shakedown to begin with, it's sort of a weirdly misplaced attack, because that's where the tool is. Now, in very different thing, but the sort of structure of, we're angry, and rightly angry at the fact that a lot of African Americans still live lives of deep disadvantage. And this creates this ferment around the fate of, somebody like George Floyd, who's a complicated figure, but shaped, as you're saying, perhaps in certain ways by his race, but certainly also by his class. But it's not very easy to take somebody who's living in the poorer segments of the Twin Cities, or in stretches of Baltimore, or in the south side of Chicago, or in the poorest parts of New York, and somehow elevate them to some form of affluence. In part because many of the people, what you can do is to take those people who are already relatively elite, who are already poets or already at an elite university, and say, well, they should now be promoted and visualized, etc. Right? And so the anger which is suscitated by the fate of the poorest Black Americans then somehow turns into every fellowship from a prestigious program, every slot on this theater schedule, every dollar from the endowment of a poetry foundation has to go to these comparatively relatively privileged people, and there's a kind of weird misplacement there, right?
There's a very weird space, because this idea of representation, through the magic of representation, an Ivy League educated upper middle class person who has a similar physical appearance in certain superficial ways to George Floyd has to be made whole, even when, and I think this is inextricable from the backlash, even when objectively, regardless of ancestry and historical circumstance and oppression, they're probably in an advantageous position vis-a-vis most white Americans. And see, that is something that I think a lot of people were seeing with their own eyes, that people that were already doing better than them were also somehow representing or being represented by George Floyd and being given advantages that were just compounding the spoils they've already received in that game of representation. And so I think that created oftentimes, extraordinary racist backlash that's unjustifiable, but also it was an awareness that these people are already getting by fine in the meritocracy. It was a very strange thing to witness. I have a good friend who I met by profiling him a couple of years ago, Michael R. Jackson. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning playwright, just a brilliant guy. And, he's black, and he said, George Floyd died, and one of my, a theater goer writes me and says, I need to buy you a bulletproof vest. And he says, why? He says, he says, I don't need that. And I'm like a success, that's almost, it's insulting even. I'm like a successful playwright. And the guy just kept demanding that he needed him to be safe and that it was open season on black males. So he just, as a joke, said, just Venmo me the worth of the guy Venmos him $400. This stuff was happening, just like that. Any Pulitzer Prize winning playwright is a stand-in for the American subaltern. And it's disrespectful to the actual plight of George Floyd. It trivializes the challenges that he was actually against. To think that giving any black person within your vicinity $5 by Venmo to get a Starbucks, which was happening, that somehow is addressing the deep and severe inequality that does have roots in the American, the slave trade and American chattel slavery and the African slave trade. To think that can be redeemed by just reaching for any person of color in your vicinity and trying to make them whole in some small way that makes you feel good. This was kind of the madness of 2020. I think the black square phenomenon where white people were not even interacting with black people, but were just amongst themselves exerting a kind of pressure to perform the care of black people that never even required the presence of a black person. This was astonishing. It had physical instantiations in places like Portland. There's these neighborhoods where not a single black person lives. There might be somebody sleeping on the street nearby, but no one owns a home in these neighborhoods, and every home had Black Lives Matter on it. There's more Black Lives Matter signs than black neighbors. And this is just, it's intra-white kind of status jockeying and virtue signaling. And I think that rubbed a good proportion of the country the wrong way. And, this is also linked to the phenomenon that really gets short shrift still, is that Trump built in coming back in 2024 after the pandemic loss in 2020, he steadily built increasing support among blacks and Latinos and other people of color, so-called people of color, who felt alienated from that kind of white virtue signaling too.
Yeah, so one thing that strikes me is that in 2016, Trump, during the election campaign, said, explicitly addressing African Americans, vote for me, what do you have to lose? And rightly, that elicited a lot of outrage of people saying, what do you mean black people don't have anything to lose? A lot of black people have a lot to lose in this country, right? And somehow in 2020, that line by Trump became the standard representation of African Americans in the mainstream media. That the state and the fate of the average black person in the United States is so dire that they've got nothing to lose, basically, right? And they don't have anything to lose if people torch down neighborhoods, many of which are disproportionately
their
black,
own
right?
businesses.
And of course, I thought about this a good amount when I was writing The Great Experiment, and I looked into a lot of figures and data, etc., about various minority groups in the United States, particularly African Americans, and there's sort of two truths that we have to hold in our heads at the same time, and somehow that seems too complicated for a lot of political discourse. And the first of those is that the average African American is doing pretty well. In fact, the average African American is now more affluent than the average European, in part because the standard of living of the United States is now much higher than that of Europe. But on like all the relevant metrics, the average African American is more affluent than the average European. And I have a line in that book. The average African American lives in the suburbs rather than the inner city. They have a white collar job rather than a blue collar job or an unskilled work. They have employer sponsored health insurance, which is of course a sign of having a relatively high quality job, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right now, at the same time, there is a disproportionate share of African Americans who do suffer from the kind of compound disadvantage that George Floyd suffered from. Right? That is not the majority of African Americans, not anywhere close to it, but it is proportionate. And there's absolutely also Latinos, Asian Americans, and of course white people who suffer from that compound disadvantage. But it is disproportionately high. And obviously when you are in some parts of the country, whether it's the south side of Chicago, certain parts of Philly, etc., you see that. And that is a real challenge. What's so frustrating about this conversation is the inability to keep those two things in our heads at the same time. But there's now a big, thriving black upper and upper middle class, that the average black American leads a pretty decent life by comparison to any other country today and any period in the history of mankind. And that there's also a tragically disproportionate share of black people who, because of the legacy of slavery and a million other things, still do continue to suffer from those kind of injustices. And a politics that takes all three of those insights seriously would be a lot more productive than one that only focuses on one of those 3 points.
That's right. It would require a kind of nuance that I think is actually difficult to achieve because of that technological component of the past 10 to 15 years that we're thinking about when we think about the social justice movement that really rose up to dominate institutions. One of the things that's at play here, yes, class is raced and race is classed, but neither is a adequate stand-in for the other. Most poor people in America are still white, numerically by far, and plenty of black people have never experienced anything like what George Floyd lived through prior to his death. But one of the things that I think distorts the public conversation in our politics so much and has really become a huge problem since about, you would have to say since like 2012, 2013, but it's the rise of Twitter and other social media platforms with the iPhone in the pocket and the camera technology we have and the ability to disseminate videos and the algorithmic sharing of feeds. People have no conception of the amount of unarmed black people that are actually killed by police. I mean, I think the year that George Floyd died, people thought 1,000 unarmed black people a year when they were polled died a year. It's not close to that. It's like 25 in a population of 44 million in a nation of like 330 million. It's absolutely abhorrent. But it is not the genocide that some people were saying there's a black genocide, as the letter to the Poetry Foundation board actually stated. It's nothing like that, but the kind of ubiquity of the spectacle of Black Death and this notion that black men are being stalked and this kind of this incessant display of black pain and suffering and violence against what was at the time called black bodies. I think that really shaped the politics around this being a kind of emergency that couldn't rely on the usual way of doing business, and any means necessary was required for an intervention against the kind of precarity with which black people's lives are lived. This is a feature of a society that doesn't have a sense of how large it is or what the actual face of, numerically most people killed by police are also white, but very few people actually appreciate that. The people think that there's more black people in the country than there are even. So there's a lack of understanding of numbers and probability and frequency of occurrences that I think really distorts what we're talking about when we talk about class, race, law enforcement, and I don't know how to actually get over that. When you look at people's perceptions of black crime, it's also similarly distorted, and since Elon Musk took over Twitter, you get this kind of incessant black crime porn that makes people think that, Black people are much more deserving of violent responses from the police than, in fact, we are. So the whole thing, I think, gets social media exacerbates all the kind of discursive problems that we're seeing.
Yeah. Another element of the summer of 2020, which seems peculiar in retrospect, and which I think does help to build your thesis that all of this led to considerable backlash, is the cancellations of people who had minor or imagined transgressions against the politics of the moment, and just the kind of culture of collective irrationality around some of those things. I've written about a bunch of these things. I mean, listeners to this podcast will recall some of these examples. The Latino utility worker who is accused of doing a white supremacist sign when he just has his hand dangling out of a truck. The sign he's accused of making is just the OK sign, which for most people in America just means that's okay, but in some weird corners of the internet has become, associated with far right. The professor who holds a lecture about filler words, advising people not to say and and well, and who then for his 1/3 Chinese student body also repeats a few times the most common Chinese filler word, which has some passing resemblance to the N-word, and thereby gets denounced by his dean and suspended from his teaching. We can go on with those. I want to make 2 points about this. The first is how the background of a pandemic had, I think, a lot to do with that as well. That if you have all day to sit at home and find things to be upset about on Twitter, if you have staff meetings in which you're not physically in the same room and you can't look each other in the same eye and you can't take somebody apart saying, hey, let's work this out, that makes it much easier to all take to Slack or take to a Zoom chat and say this person is evil, they got to be fired right now. And I think a lot of the most absurd examples of what happened in 2020 are a product of that. But the second is that I think does have lasting impacts in ways people underestimate. By definition, everything that we read about in terms of these cancellations are stories of relatively prominent people at relatively prominent institutions. Otherwise, we wouldn't read about it, right? It wouldn't make the New York Times. But I'm just struck by how many people who are actually quite sympathetic to woke ideology in various ways, who are certainly sympathetic to the protests over the killing of George Floyd, have since told me about their personal stories, in obscure organizations involving obscure people, being cancelled in the same kind of way. And I do think that when you're trying to look at why it is that so many Latinos, Asian Americans, some African Americans have moved away from the Democrats over the last 5 years, and why so many young people, who I think often experience those cancellations in middle school, right, in their communities, have become quite skeptical about the political left in America. Joe Biden's age and all of that obviously played a role as well. I think that does have some of its roots in that really unforgiving culture of cancellation.
Yeah, forgiving is the word. There's such little space for grace anywhere now, and I think that is directly related to the kind of ease with which somebody can just become a representation of something abhorrent that's not attached to an actual person's, complexity. So you're interacting with people. The pandemic made us retreat to our screens. You don't walk out into the hallway and work things out, but you make an example of your own. You perform your own values by targeting somebody who represents the wrong values, and you jockey for status and position that way. Let's not forget, these types of purges, as Hannah Arendt even pointed out, purges are job opportunities. People were getting rid of people with outmoded ways of thinking and sliding into promotional slots in the organizations that they thought that they would run better. That's part of it. And then what you're talking about also that I think is really important is that cancellations are just the things that you read about. And as you say, they're at the institutions that you read about. But the much more important thing going on is the onlooker effect. The amount of people you never read about being canceled because they watched the example be made and then they self-censored. And that really, really is, I think, pragmatically very ineffective if what you want to do is understand the polity that you live in. You have this situation where people have preference falsification. You're continuously surprised at the amount of support someone like Donald Trump has because everybody's unwilling to say what they actually think about issues because there is no grace extended and there is no notion of good faith disagreement on certain issues. So every election, how is he winning? How is he gaining with black males? How is he gaining with Latinos? Was because no one's telling you what they actually think. And that is, I think, maybe the most destructive consequence of the kind of identity left, coercive virtue signaling and monothought that really like dominated the most influential academic, media, cultural spaces that we all have to, make this society through. Cancellation to this day is really downplayed. Anytime you try to talk about one of the things that you mentioned or any of the ones that I mentioned in the book, the response is Trump is disappearing people or any number of whataboutisms. But the idea that politics can be conducted where something is only wrong when it's done against the values that I hold, I mean, that just doesn't work. That cannot work. And so I think that, this is probably the most naive thing I'd advocate for, but there really has to be some kind of move back to extending grace and allowing for people to disagree and trying to have that kind of nuanced compromise or negotiation about what values can be. And especially when we're talking about values that are not yet set as agreed upon norms. Most of the cancellations also happened on kind of contested norms that were not yet set in place, like even more than race around gender. That somebody could be canceled for saying the wrong thing that wasn't yet agreed upon, or it wasn't yet a consensus. And that was kind of a way of staking out the territory, making an example of somebody so that you now have a new norm. And I think that was extraordinarily destructive. And I'll just end the point by saying that if you're actually just trying to achieve greater dignity and inclusion for, say, trans people, well, what did that actually achieve? Because it was a Pyrrhic victory. Because now there's even less than there had been prior to that kind of moment where we could say that they overplayed the hand.
One of the ways in which that moment has stayed with me, and I think will stay with me for the rest of my life, is that I do feel I've experienced what it feels like to live through a kind of collective moral panic. I want to be clear that the punishments that were meted out in 2020 were not comparable to those that were meted out in, Salem in, the 17th century or in China in the 1960s. But many of the mechanisms were, right? The accusation of a thought crime, of a weird behavior, which were often extremely circumstantial. The fact that anybody who then came to the defense of that person themselves immediately made themselves guilty and subject to attack. The forms of enforced silence. I mean, I'm just struck by how in those months and years, people, when you would talk about certain subjects in, a random Starbucks somewhere where you didn't have any reason to think that anybody who knew you was anywhere around, would just like inadvertently and without being conscious of it, just like drop the level of sound which we're speaking by an order of magnitude, and suddenly they're nearly whispering, and sometimes I pointed it out, but you realize you suddenly started whispering, and people were kind of taken aback and shocked by it, but said, oh yeah, I guess that's right. I was subconsciously worried that someone might overhear what I'm saying. And that to me has, I think, I guess positively framed, revealed something about human nature that I had read about in books, but that I now understand more fully. I suppose that's a positive thing. But I think I'm quite an optimistic person, I think, in general, has made me a little bit more pessimistic about human nature. I mean, these forms of collective moral panic are ever-present human possibility. And they're present on the right as well as the left, and they're present in the service of exclusion and nationalism, as well as the supposed service of fighting for the inclusion of minority groups. And if we don't learn that lesson of always being on the guard against those forms of collective mania and punishment, I think it's going to have very bad effects in all kinds of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're really talking about the fundamental aspect of human nature that is searching for scapegoats, designating scapegoats, and the kind of, as René Girard points out so well, the kind of communal cohesion and harmony that's achieved through the designation and punishment or outcasting of the scapegoat. That's so real. And I think that why 2020 matters so much to me and why I couldn't just move on and worry about the next thing is because you're right. That is the first time in my life, I'm 44 years old, that I ever saw that play itself out. And it's terrifying. And people think that there's no big deal and you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet. And if some privileged editor loses a job, why are we all sitting here talking about it? But the effects are much more destructive than that. And, guilt by association is one of the most nefarious things that you can have in public life. And, the shaming of people who don't try and convict somebody based off of the accusation. I think that's one of the scariest things that was really weaponized at this time. And then what has happened is that we do have to acknowledge that everything is more intense and disturbing and dangerous when it has the power of the government behind it. But any number of kind of punitive measures or things that look like cancel culture that the Trump administration is doing, you can find a precedent for that happened in the years preceding in any number of institutions that were brought about by the left. And so this always forms the kind of, and it might be a cynical justification, but it forms the justification in their minds and in their excuse making that they use for why they're doing this now. Because you have a situation where both sides see that the normal way, the liberal way of doing business can't be demanded of them in a state of emergency, and this is emergency, and they have to win at all costs. It's a zero-sum game. And so, yeah, I've been left a bit more pessimistic too, but I ultimately do think that I just have to believe. This is the part of me that was shaped during the the Obama era, and I can't quite shake it. I have to believe that glimpse of a kind of multi-ethnic society that wanted to transcend the divisions and oppressions of the past. I have to believe that still is really possible and what the country wants, and that we're on a detour. A very dangerous one, more dangerous than I had thought even in 2016, but that we ultimately do have the ability to and want to get back to that kind of direction that Obama, I think, really opened up when he showed that the country was happy at the idea that it could perhaps become post-racial.
This moment when Obama emerges as a major party presidential candidate, gets elected, has astonishingly high approval ratings in the first weeks and months of his presidency, is very shaping of a different vision of human nature and a different vision of American politics. It happens to be a moment that is key to my own view of the world for biographical reasons. I came to Columbia for a year as a visiting student in 2005, but then started my PhD in 2007. So it's really in 2007 that I started living in the United States in a more permanent way. And that is right around the time when Obama is emerging as a credible challenger to Hillary Clinton in the primaries, where he goes from being a figure of hope that sort of captured the imagination in that famous speech at the DNC in 2004 to people thinking, hang on a second, he really might actually win this, right? The hopeful story of his election and victory against, by the way, also a very decent man, John McCain, and that effervescent hope in what that might mean for America still remains part of my vision of what this country can be. And I think that's another point that we have in common. How should we think about that now? I mean, I think there was a way of casting Obama's victory as the promise of a post-racial America that Obama never really formulated in that way. I mean, I think thoughtful critic at that time never bought into either, right? And by the way, it's amazing when you look again, like how the consensus can swap. I mean, if you look at like the writings of some NBC New York Times columnists in 2008, they were all talking about how race is over forever, post-racial society. I'm not saying they're all talking about that, that's probably unfair, but there was really, a bunch of really uncritical celebration of it. I don't think that's what the smartest people were saying at the time. I don't think that's what Obama was saying exactly, right? There's a distinction between thinking that somehow, because Obama was elected, the problem of race has disappeared from public life, and on the other hand, an insistence that race is always going to be the primary fact about America. What's the smart middle here? I mean, what do you think, in retrospect, is the interpretation of the promise of moving beyond the role that race played in a certain kind of way in American society and politics up until that point, that Obama still lastingly represents? In what ways was the idea of post-racialism always an unrealistic fad when it comes to those more extreme interpretations of it, of saying now that Obama is elected, it just none of us see race anymore, and all of that is in the past, which obviously I think was not just with the benefit of hindsight, but always knowably a mistake. So what's the formulation of that we should hold on to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was always, in retrospect, far too much made of one extraordinarily talented man's achievement. And it was always too much to expect that the election of a president could heal an entire nation and its multi-century history. I mean, I like Thomas Friedman, but at the time, you're right, he wasn't alone. I mean, the hyperbole at the time of the election, Thomas Friedman said on November, whatever the day was, 2008, the last shot in the American Civil War was fired. I mean, there were lines like this everywhere, and I think that was always too much was made of it. And I think, in retrospect, like the kind of disastrous presidency of George W. Bush made possible the rise of someone like Obama and the willingness to take a chance on an outsider like that, I think the kind of profound disillusion that began to set in his second term, and that came about, with these high-profile killings of Trayvon Martin and then Michael Brown, and this kind of growing sense that not only did the post-racist society not come about, but it's even more hopeless than we had thought, because this is happening on the watch of the first black president. I think that disillusion, and then the kind of reflexive backlash that some part of the country will always be racist. I don't want to act like I'm a complete knife. Some part of the country did not like the optics of Barack and Michelle Obama and their family in the White House, and that began on day one with elements of the Tea Party, and that morphed into MAGA. But there were also, voters in play that voted for both Obama and for Trump, and that there were voters who voted for McCain who were simply proud of their country, even in defeat. And those people, I think, are in play, and those are the people that give me optimism now. But it would be just wrong to say that Obama didn't make possible, I think, in retrospect, the rise of Trump. And it was not just Obama, but it was this idea that the nation is just changing extremely fast, and Obama is passing the baton now to the first woman president. And I think that combination, along with him losing the kind of inspiration that he had held in the first term, and during his ascent, that made possible this kind of extraordinary slippage. But to answer your question, the kind of sensible thing to hold on to, I think, is that look, we live in a dynamic society that is very different than the one I spend the rest of my year in France. It's very different than comparable wealthy societies, and it's like nothing in many parts of the world. We live in a society where members of the most discriminated against minority can rise to the upper echelons of the society and can do that through popular support. We live in a society where you don't just have the president like Barack Obama, but you have, he represents an entire class of people that this society produces. That's something that we should be extremely proud of, and that's something that we should build upon. And there's a backlash against that and a desire to turn back the clock to a society that has less visibility, perhaps, but we're not going back in that direction. And I think that, the post-racial society where we can say, I want your race to mean as little as possible when I meet you as an individual. I think he gave us a hint of what that would look like in practice. And I think that we can say that we saw that, we know that happened, we know that this is not who we have to be, and we can build upon that. And I think in some ways we even are, in a perverse way. Look at how diverse the Trump administration actually can be. A kind of multi-ethnic governing class, I think that that's always going to be with us, and in a way that kind of this strange echo of Obama's multi-ethnic society is represented in MAGA. I mean, Trump is growing the kind of multi-ethnic support that that a Republican hasn't had since Richard Nixon, based on some polling that I've seen, or exit polling. So maybe the message that we should really take is that more diversity and just inclusion isn't going to solve all of these kind of fundamental problems and political disagreements. And so it's going to be necessary to have a multi-ethnic society that represents people from diverse backgrounds, but it's not going to be sufficient to have a liberal, open society that actually achieves all of the other ends that we seek.
And that's one of the weird paradoxes about Trump, which is that on the one side, his ascent seems to valorize the most pessimistic and I think misguided interpretations of American history. I mean, again, when you go to the summer of 2020, what people are saying is that America is still exactly what it always was. There's been no progress of any kind. This country's DNA is racist. The country is defined not by 1789 and not additionally by 1619, the year that slaves first arrived, on American shores, but rather fundamentally by 1619. And you can see how, in a sense, Trump's crudeness and the racial anger that did help to some extent to elect him gives a kind of excuse, a fig leaf for all of those claims. I don't think it makes those claims right, but you can see how those claims become more attractive in light of that. And at the same time, the remarkable fact about Donald Trump is that between 2016 and 2024, he lost significant shares of vote among white people and significantly increased the share of vote among non-white people. And that, as you're saying, in 2024, he put together an astonishingly diverse racial coalition in that election. And it's somehow hard, again, to keep those two very contradictory things in our minds at the same time.
Yeah, I think that mere diversity can never be the end in itself. And I think that this is a point that Bernie Sanders has made, that it's not good enough just to have 13% of the billionaire class be black and X amount be Latino or female or whatever. But actually, like, ideas matter, viewpoints matter. And, to have a bunch of people who are superficially diverse, but essentially are operating and thinking the same, isn't necessarily going to create the change. So I think that, like, this is a good lesson for liberals to learn in general, is that I don't think that just diversity will solve all of the problems, whether it's from the left or from the right. Just getting an Indian running the FBI, that's just a superficial change if he's operating from a political position that you already find objectionable. So I think we have to, maybe what we actually need is we got the first black president, we're going to keep getting increasing diversity, and we need to focus on rallying around the values that matter, irrespective of somebody's racial or gender or whatever background. But it's actually ideas and values that matter and have to be able to be universally bought into or universally applied, or you have to be able to persuade people no matter their background, and that it's not good enough. Post-racialism isn't good enough if the society we live in is still grossly unequal.
And avoids a rank form of tribalism, which unfortunately, shapes so much of the American public sphere today. You've been very critical of the left in your book and in this conversation. Perhaps there will be a smart strategy to get followers and sell books if you then were silent about the criticisms you have about Donald Trump. But like me, you regard this administration as a very clear and present danger for some fundamental democratic norms and the rule of law in this country. Tell us about how you think that those attacks are related to those broader themes and developments we've talked about in the rest of the conversation, and how we should think about what Trump and his administration have been doing for the last 6 months.
Well, I mean, like you, I think this is one of the most dangerous. This is the most dangerous political moment I've experienced. I think that we really face a kind of creeping authoritarianism that's not even creeping anymore, but is just there, is acting. It's fully present. We're watching institutions this time around not actually be able to remain independent, not be able to maintain integrity. He's actually warping the way that the government shapes society. He's been more effective in, we talked about what he's done to universities, but also, the way he's attacked media, the way he's attacked law firms, the way he's gotten people to preemptively obey, the way he's hollowed out the State Department or the Department of Justice and brought cronies in, the kind of way that he's taught, I would say he's taught an enormous amount of people on the right to in the Republican Party to do politics will have far-reaching and long-lasting consequences long after he's no longer among us. And we have yet to see what type of effect it has on the left. They haven't really marshaled a response yet, but it seems to me that he's distorted and perverted American political culture for a generation, or at least. And so, I think you mentioned selling books. It would be very easy to make an argument that just stayed on target against what I think were the extraordinary abuses of the left over the past decade and change when they were ascendant. But that would be a dishonest book. And I really mean it. And I think it would be a book that might find an audience more easily. It's very difficult, actually. It requires a kind of long form to talk about the ideas in the book because they don't neatly fit on one team or another. But it would be dishonest to not acknowledge, and I do repeatedly in the book, that what Trump is doing is worse. But it's a form of, you're fooling yourself if you think what Trump is doing and why it is deemed by a plurality of voters more attractive than what came before it. You're fooling yourself if you don't think that that's related to the excesses of the left. And so this is a story about failures from both extremes and a kind of plea for a sensible response from the center.
I think that goes to the core of why this is such a vital book, which is to say that it is important to keep track and to clearly oppose the things that the Trump administration does. And that's something that I do in this podcast, in my writing and in Persuasion. But we're fooling ourselves if continuing to do what I've certainly done for 10 years, which is to warn about the dangers of right-wing authoritarian populism, is somehow going to protect us from those dangers. We've been doing that for 10 years, and guys, it's not working very well. And much as I admire those outlets that devote themselves just to screaming from the rooftops about every latest outrage that Trump has done, I've grown deeply convinced over the last years that any way to move out of this deeply perilous political moment has to require building a political vision, a language, a way of understanding the world, a way of talking about it, that both speaks to the world and the worldview and the exigencies of 2025 and not of 2000, which I think the worldview we're mostly stuck with in the more moderate established, or for that matter, center-left or left-of-center space. And that can therefore build a new consensus around which most Americans can coalesce. Unfortunately, if you're shouting about the flaws of Trump every day in the ever same ways, you reach a motivated audience of people who already agree with you, but you don't expand that coalition. And even if Democrats are somehow able to win a narrow victory in 2028 and make sure that Trump doesn't get to place his chosen successor into the White House, which is very important, if they haven't built that coalition, if they haven't broadened their appeal in that way, then by 2032 we'll be right back in it. And just as Trump became more dangerous between 2020 and 2024, just as that just led to him building a more efficient movement, the same is going to be true from 2028 to 2032. And so I think, to return to what we're talking about right at the beginning of the conversation, one answer to those critics who are saying, why talk about these things now? Isn't this a way of just fouling the nest? Isn't this a way of ignoring what's really important? This is the intellectual work that's necessary if we actually want to rebuild a politics that can confront this danger in a lasting way, and not just at the midterms.
I really couldn't agree more. A new vision that's attractive to most people has to be put forth. And what I hear on the left, on the side that I'm most concerned with critiquing in the book, is disturbing. I hear a lot of essentially real Marxism hasn't been tried yet. We need to elect people like Mamdani in New York and really double down on the very things that not just whites, but a growing multi-ethnic plurality said is less attractive to them than the known abuses that they already associate with Donald Trump. I mean, I think that the Democratic Party is at near historic lows. It's if not at the lowest point it's ever been measured at. It's just not an attractive politics to most Americans, and so just consistently banging the drum that Trump is outrageous, it doesn't work. I think a lot of people have made peace with whatever Trump does that's wrong, and kind of don't pay attention to politics nearly enough to stay up on the latest outrage, and think that it's basically just a bunch of people that criticize Trump no matter what, so they tune it out. I think the only way forward is a compelling vision, and I don't think in this country, in this society that we have now, a compelling vision is the one that Zoran Mamdani represents, and that seems to get some amount of excitement from the activist class, but can't actually grow the cohort that wants to vote Democrat in 2028, that can't actually reject that kind of reactionary populism that MAGA represents. Something else is necessary, and we need new leaders, and we don't have it right now. And just the fact that you're supposed to not point out the failings of the left because it gives ammunition to the right, I think is a defeatist mentality. I think you have to have the strength to self-critique so you can self-correct. So I'm really hoping that the liberal center can reclaim the Democratic Party from the kind of the sway of the activists. I think that was one of the main reasons why Kamala couldn't get over the hill in 2024, was that she was too associated with views and with positions that are tainted in the broader American public's mind.
Thomas Chatterton Williams. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, and thank you so much for your book.
Such a pleasure to talk to you, Yascha.